At 68, I realized I had become invisible in my own home. The thought didn't arrive like a storm. It came quietly, the way dust settles on furniture you forgot you owned. I was standing in the kitchen that morning, the same kitchen I had spent 32 years building a life in, when Rachel walked past me without so much as a glance. Not a good morning. Not even a nod. Just the soft click of her heels against the hardwood floor I had chosen, paid for, and polished for decades. I remember holding my coffee cup, watching the steam rise, and wondering how something so small could feel so final. It wasn't the first time, of course. These things never begin with a single moment. They build slowly, layer by layer, until one day you wake up and realize you're no longer part of your own story. The house used to sound different. Laughter used to echo through these walls. My husband, Richard, had a way of filling every room with warmth, even on the coldest winter mornings when the temperature dropped below freezing and the windows frosted over. He used to say this house was our legacy, something we would pass down with pride. But Richard had been gone for 3 years now, and somewhere in that time, everything had shifted. At first, it was subtle. Rachel rearranged the living room for better lighting. Then she replaced my dishes with a newer set, something more modern, she said. I told myself it was harmless. Young people have their ways. Then came the changes that didn't feel so harmless. My name slowly disappeared from conversations. Decisions were made without me. Even small things, like what to cook for dinner or when to invite guests, no longer included my voice. I became a guest in a home that once carried my fingerprints in every corner. Daniel, my son, noticed it too. I know he did. But noticing and acting are two very different things. He would give me that look sometimes, a quick glance filled with something between guilt and avoidance, before turning back to Rachel as if she held the answers to questions he no longer asked me. I used to think love was enough. That raising a child with patience and sacrifice meant something permanent. But love, I was beginning to understand, doesn't guarantee loyalty. And loyalty, once gone, doesn't announce its departure. It just fades. That morning, I set the table for 3, just like I always did. 3 plates, 3 forks, 3 glasses. It was a habit I hadn't broken, even though I knew Rachel preferred to eat later, after her morning meetings, and Daniel often skipped breakfast altogether. Still, I set the table. It felt like holding on to something I wasn't ready to let go of. When Rachel finally spoke, it wasn't to me. Daniel, we should really think about converting that extra room, she said, her voice casual, almost thoughtful. Your mom doesn't need that much space anymore. I froze, my hand still resting on the back of the chair. Your mom. Not Eleanor. Not even mom. Just a reference. A detail. Something to be managed. Daniel didn't respond right away. He never did when it came to things like this. Silence had become his safest answer. Maybe, he said eventually, his voice low, uncertain. Maybe. That word echoed in my chest longer than it should have. Because maybe wasn't a no. It wasn't even hesitation. It was permission, wrapped in politeness. I nodded to myself, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Not because I agreed, but because, for the first time, I understood something with absolute clarity. Time wasn't just passing. It was running out. And if I stayed exactly where I was, doing exactly what I had always done, I would disappear completely, not all at once, but piece by piece, until there was nothing left of me but memories no one bothered to revisit. I picked up my coffee, now lukewarm, and took a small sip. It tasted different. Or maybe I did. Either way, something had shifted. Not in the house. Not in them. In me. And for the first time in years, that realization didn't scare me. It steadied me. I began to notice the quiet patterns after that morning, the kind of patterns that only reveal themselves when you finally stop pretending everything is normal. It was not one big moment that changed everything, but a series of small adjustments that made my world feel smaller with each passing day. The house itself had not changed in size, but the space I occupied within it had been carefully reduced, almost politely, until it no longer felt like mine. My bedroom, once the master suite that Richard and I had shared, had been moved downstairs for convenience after he passed. Rachel said it would be easier for me, fewer stairs, safer as I got older. I had agreed at the time because it sounded reasonable, because I did not want to be difficult, because I trusted that my place in the family was secure enough not to be threatened by something so small. But now, Standing in that smaller room with its single window facing the side yard instead of the garden Richard had loved, I understood that convenience had never really been the point. The master bedroom upstairs was now theirs, along with the sunlight, the space, and the sense of ownership that came with it. My room felt like a waiting area, temporary, as if I might be leaving soon, and everyone already knew it except me. Even the closet told a story. My clothes, once neatly arranged by season and color, had been pushed to one side to make room for storage boxes that did not belong to me. Holiday decorations, old files, things Rachel said needed to be kept but not seen. I found myself folding my sweaters tighter, stacking them smaller, adjusting without being asked, as if I were trying to take up less space in every possible way. It was not just the physical space that had shifted. The rhythm of the house had changed too. Dinner used to be a shared moment, something we gathered around, something that marked the end of the day and the beginning of conversation. Now it was fragmented. Rachel often ate later. Daniel ate quickly between phone calls, and I found myself sitting alone at the table more often than not, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the television in the living room. Sometimes I would wait, thinking they might join me, but waiting had become a habit that no longer led to anything. The conversations that did happen were brief and practical. Did you pay the utility bill? The trash goes out on Thursday. There is a package coming tomorrow. My life had been reduced to reminders and small tasks, things that could easily be replaced or reassigned. One afternoon, I overheard Rachel on the phone in the living room. She was speaking in that calm, measured tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. It is just a matter of time, she said. We need to think ahead. It would be better for everyone. I did not hear the rest of the conversation, but I did not need to. The words settled into me with a quiet certainty. It is just a matter of time. I stood in the hallway for a moment, my hand resting against the wall, feeling the familiar texture of the paint beneath my fingers. I remembered choosing that color, standing in a hardware store with Richard, debating between shades of cream and soft gray, laughing at how seriously we were taking something so small. Back then, every decision had felt like building something together. Now, decisions were being made around me, over me, without me. Daniel came home later that evening, his footsteps heavy but quick, as if he were moving through the house without really seeing it. Mom, he said, pausing just long enough to acknowledge me before heading upstairs. I watched him go, the same boy I had once held in my arms now moving through life with a distance I could not cross. I wanted to say something, to ask him if he noticed what was happening, if he understood what it felt like to slowly fade out of your own life. But the words did not come. Not because I did not have them, but because I was beginning to understand that he was no longer the person who would hear them. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, the smaller bed, the one that had replaced the king-sized frame Richard and I had shared for decades. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, and for the first time, the silence did not feel peaceful. It felt final. I looked around at the walls, at the single framed photo of Richard I had kept, at the lamp that cast a soft, dim light across the room, and I realized something that settled deeper than any fear I had known before. I had been adjusting for years, bending, making space, accepting less, and in doing so, I had slowly erased myself without even realizing it. But now that I could see it, truly see it, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I could not keep adjusting forever. I started paying attention to the things that were no longer said out loud, because silence, I was beginning to understand, can reveal more than words ever could. It was not what Rachel told me directly that unsettled me, but what she chose to discuss when she believed I was not part of the conversation. One morning, as I stood by the sink rinsing a coffee mug, I heard her voice again, soft but deliberate, coming from the dining room where she was speaking with Daniel. We cannot keep putting this off, she said. It is not practical anymore. I did not move. I kept the water running, letting it mask the fact that I was listening. Daniel responded with a low murmur, something I could not fully make out, but I recognized the tone. It was the same tone he used when he wanted to avoid conflict, when he wanted things to resolve themselves without requiring him to take a clear position. There are places that would be better for her, Rachel continued. Communities where she can be around people her own age, where everything is taken care of. People her own age. The phrase lingered in the air, carefully chosen, polite on the surface, but carrying something else beneath it. I set the mug down slowly, my hands steady even as something inside me tightened. I had heard of these conversations before, of course. Friends from church, neighbors down the street, all with stories that began the same way. A suggestion, a concern, a conversation framed as care. And then, eventually, a decision that was no longer theirs to make. I dried my hands on a towel and walked past the dining room without looking in. Neither of them called out to me. Neither of them acknowledged that I had been there at all. Later that afternoon, I opened the mail as I always did, sorting it neatly on the kitchen counter. Bills, advertisements, a catalog I had not requested. And then, tucked between them, an envelope addressed to Daniel. It had been opened already, the flap slightly bent. I should have set it aside. I should have respected the boundary that had been quietly established over the past few years, the one that suggested I was no longer part of certain aspects of this household. But something in me hesitated. Not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. I slid the paper out carefully and glanced down. It was from a financial institution, one I recognized immediately because Richard and I had opened accounts there decades ago. The letter referenced a transfer, a restructuring of ownership, language that was formal but familiar. My eyes moved quickly across the page, not searching for details, but for confirmation of something I could already feel. The house. The word appeared halfway down the page, surrounded by legal terms and figures, but unmistakable. Ownership had been discussed. Plans had been made, and I had not been part of any of it. I folded the letter exactly as I had found it and placed it back in the envelope, aligning it carefully with the rest of the mail. My movements were precise, almost practiced, as if I had done this many times before. But I had not. This was new. This was the moment when suspicion turned into certainty. When the vague sense that something was wrong became something solid, something undeniable. That evening, Rachel mentioned dinner plans with friends, speaking over her shoulder as she walked toward the front door. "There is soup in the refrigerator if you want something," she said, not unkindly, but without warmth. Daniel followed her, already checking his phone, already halfway out of the house before the door even opened. The sound of the car pulling out of the driveway echoed through the quiet house, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, not moving, not reaching for the soup, not turning on the lights. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor, stretching the familiar shapes of furniture into something unfamiliar. I thought about Richard then, about the way he used to stand beside me in this very room, discussing everything from grocery lists to long-term plans, always making sure I was included, always making sure I knew my place was secure. That certainty had been built over years, reinforced through countless small decisions made together. And now, without him, it had been quietly dismantled, piece by piece, without confrontation, without explanation, without even the courtesy of being told. I walked slowly to the living room and sat down, my hands resting in my lap, my posture straight, composed. It would have been easy to feel overwhelmed in that moment, to let the realization consume me, to react in a way that would confirm everything they already believed about me. But I did not. Instead, I let the silence settle. I let the truth take its place without resistance. Because once something becomes clear, truly clear, it no longer has the power to confuse you. And what I saw now was not just a series of small changes or misunderstandings. It was a plan. Careful, quiet, already in motion. And for the first time, I understood that if I did nothing, if I continued to adjust and accept and remain silent, that plan would move forward exactly as intended. Without me, memory does not disappear all at once. It returns in fragments, in quiet moments when the present becomes too still to ignore. That night, after the house had settled into its familiar silence, I found myself standing in the hallway, looking at the staircase that led to the second floor. I had not gone up there in months, not since Rachel had suggested it would be easier if I stayed downstairs. At the time, I had agreed without hesitation, telling myself it was practical, that I no longer needed all that space. But now, as I stood there, I realized that I had not just given up a room. I had given up a part of my life. I placed my hand on the banister, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers, worn in places from years of use. Richard used to run his hand along this very rail every evening when he came home from work, a small habit I had never noticed until it was gone. I took a step up, then another, moving slowly, not because I had to, but because each step seemed to carry a weight I had not felt before. The upstairs looked different, though nothing had really changed. The walls were the same color, the photographs still hung in the same places, but there was a distance now, as if I were walking through a space that no longer recognized me. The master bedroom door was closed. I paused in front of it, my hand hovering just inches from the handle, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But instead, I opened it. The room was bright, filled with afternoon light streaming through the large windows that overlooked the garden. Rachel had redecorated. The curtains were different, lighter, more modern. The bedding had been replaced, the colors softer, cooler. Even the furniture had been rearranged, as if the room had been rewritten to tell a different story. I stepped inside, my eyes moving slowly across the space, taking in each detail with a quiet understanding. This had once been our room. Richard and I had chosen every piece together, from the heavy oak dresser to the reading chair by the window where he used to sit on Sunday mornings with his newspaper. That chair was gone now, replaced by something sleeker, less worn, less familiar. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden. It was still there, though not quite the same. The rose bushes Richard had planted were trimmed back, shaped into something more controlled, less wild. It looked maintained, but it did not feel alive in the same way. I closed my eyes for a moment, and the past returned with a clarity that surprised me. I could see Richard standing beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, his voice steady as he talked about plans, about the future, about how this house would always be ours. He had believed that, and I had believed him, not because we thought nothing would ever change, but because we trusted in something deeper than circumstance. We trusted in the idea that what we built together could not be quietly taken apart. But that was before I understood how easily things could shift when one voice was removed from the conversation. I opened my eyes and stepped back from the window. The room felt different now, not just because it had changed, but because I could see it clearly for what it was. Not mine. Not anymore. And perhaps it had not been for some time. I walked out into the hallway and stopped in front of the small closet at the end. It had always been a storage space, something we used for items we did not need every day. I opened it slowly, and inside, stacked neatly, were several boxes. Some of them I recognized immediately. Old photo albums, documents, things Richard and I had kept over the years, pieces of a life that had once felt permanent. They had been moved here without my knowledge, organized, contained, set aside. I knelt down and opened one of the boxes, lifting the lid carefully as if I were uncovering something fragile. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, moments captured. In time, Daniel as a child, smiling, his face open and unguarded. Richard beside him, proud, steady, present. And me, always somewhere in the frame, sometimes in the center, sometimes just to the side, but always there. I picked up one photo and held it in my hands, studying it closely. It had been taken in this very house, in the living room, years ago. We were all there, together, and there was no question then about where I belonged. I closed the box gently and stood up, my movements slow but deliberate. The past was not gone. It had not disappeared. It had simply been placed somewhere out of sight, much like everything else that no longer fit into the life that was being created without me. As I walked back toward the stairs, I felt something settle inside me, not heavy, not overwhelming, but clear. I had spent years holding on to what this house used to be, to what it had meant, to the life I had built within it. But now, standing there in the quiet hallway, I understood that the past could not protect me from the present. And more importantly, it could not define what I would do next. The breaking point did not come with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrived in a tone so calm, so measured, that it almost sounded like kindness. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind that used to be reserved for family, for shared meals and long conversations that stretched into the evening. Now it felt like any other day, quiet, distant, divided. I was sitting at the dining table with a book open in front of me, though I had not turned a page in nearly 20 minutes. Rachel and Daniel were in the living room, their voices low but clear enough to carry through the open space. I had learned not to look in their direction when they spoke like that, not to make it obvious that I could hear them. Instead, I kept my eyes on the same line of text, letting the words blur into something unreadable. "I spoke to someone this week," Rachel said, her voice steady, almost thoughtful. There are really nice places not far from here. Clean, quiet, with activities and staff available around the clock. There was a pause, the kind that invites agreement without demanding it. Daniel did not answer right away. I could picture him sitting there, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped, considering how to respond without creating tension. I do not know, he said finally. It feels sudden. Sudden. The words settled into the room like something misplaced. Nothing about this felt sudden to me. It felt like the natural conclusion to a process that had been unfolding for years. It is not sudden, Rachel replied gently. We have been talking about making changes for a while. This is just the next step. It would be better for her. She would have people around her. She would not be alone all day. Alone. I almost smiled at that. The irony was so quiet, so complete, that it did not need to be pointed out. I had been alone in this house long before they ever considered sending me somewhere else. Daniel exhaled slowly, a sound that carried more weight than his words. Maybe we should talk to her first, he said. Rachel did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was softer, but there was something firm beneath it. Of course, but we need to be realistic. She cannot stay here forever. I closed the book then, not because I had finished reading, but because there was nothing left to pretend. The conversation had moved from possibility to decision, from suggestion to planning, and I had not been part of any of it. I stood up slowly, my movement steady, controlled. There was no rush, no urgency, just a quiet certainty guiding each step. I walked into the living room, not hesitating, not announcing myself, simply entering the space as if I still belonged there. They both looked up at the same time. Rachel's expression shifted first, smoothing into something polite, composed. Daniel's followed, a flicker of surprise quickly replaced by something more guarded. I made tea, I said, my voice even, almost gentle. Would either of you like some? It was not what they expected. I could see it in the way Rachel blinked, just once, as if recalibrating. Daniel shook his head. No, thank you, Mom. Rachel smiled. I am fine, Eleanor. Eleanor. Not Mom. Not even a softened version of it. Just my name, clean and distant. I nodded once, as if that answered everything, and turned back toward the kitchen. I did not ask about their conversation. I did not question their plans. There was nothing to gain from forcing a moment they were not prepared to give honestly. But something inside me had shifted in a way that could not be undone. As I stood at the counter, pouring hot water into the cup, I realized that fear had been the one thing holding me in place for so long. Fear of change. Fear of confrontation. Fear of losing what little connection remained. But now, listening to them speak about my life as if it were a problem to be solved, I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. I was already losing it. Not in the future. Not someday. Now. The tea steeped quietly, the color deepening in the cup, a slow transformation that mirrored something I could feel within myself. I had spent years waiting for things to return to what they once were, for understanding to replace distance, for respect to reappear without being asked. But waiting had not preserved anything. It had only made it easier for others to decide what my life should become. I picked up the cup and held it in both hands, feeling the warmth settle into my palms. For the first time in a long while, the fear did not rise up to meet me. In its place was something steadier, something quieter, but far more certain. If they believed my future was something they could arrange without me, then they had misunderstood one very important thing. I was still here, and I was not finished deciding what my life would look like. The next morning began like any other, quiet and unremarkable, but there was a difference in the way I moved through it. Not visible from the outside. Not something Rachel or Daniel would have noticed, but something internal, precise, and deliberate. I woke before sunrise, as I often did, the house still wrapped in that early silence that feels untouched by the day ahead. For a moment, I lay there in the dim light, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of a car passing somewhere down the street, and I realized that for the first time in years, I was not waiting for something to happen. I was deciding. I got up slowly and dressed with the same care I used to reserve for special occasions. Choosing a simple blouse and a pair of slacks that still fit me well. There was something grounding in the act of preparing myself, of presenting myself not as someone who had been set aside, but as someone who still had a place to stand. In the kitchen, I made my coffee the way I always had, measuring the grounds, pouring the water, letting the familiar routine settle my thoughts. Rachel had not come down yet, and Daniel's car was still in the driveway, which meant he had not left for work. I glanced at the clock on the wall, noting the time, not because I needed to, but because I was beginning to pay attention to details again, to the small markers of a life that was still mine to observe. After finishing my coffee, I went to my room and retrieved a small folder from the bottom drawer of my dresser. It had been there for years, untouched, containing documents I had not felt the need to revisit. Papers Richard and I had organized together, things we had put in place with the assumption that they would remain as we intended. I sat down at the small desk by the window and opened it carefully. Inside were copies of the original deed, bank statements, and a will that had been drafted long before Rachel had ever entered our lives. I ran my fingers lightly over the pages, not searching for surprises, but confirming what I already knew. These were not just documents. They were decisions. Decisions that had been made with intention, with clarity, with the understanding that our life was something we controlled, not something that could be quietly redirected by others. I closed the folder and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was not heavy, not in a physical sense, but in what it represented. I stood up, placed it into my handbag, and took a deep breath that felt steady rather than uncertain. When I stepped into the hallway, Rachel was just coming down the stairs, her phone already in her hand, her attention divided between the screen and the day ahead. She glanced at me briefly, her expression neutral. "You are up early," she said, not unkindly, but without interest. "I have a few things to take care of," I replied, my voice calm, even. She nodded once, already looking back at her phone. "All right. Do you need anything?" It was a question that sounded polite, but we both understood it was not an invitation. "No," I said simply. Daniel appeared a moment later, adjusting his tie, his movements hurried but controlled. He paused when he saw me, his expression softening slightly. "Heading out?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Just some errands." He nodded, accepting the answer without further question, and for a brief moment, I wondered if he sensed anything different. If he could feel the shift that had taken place, the quiet realignment of something he had once taken for granted. But if he did not show it. I picked up my handbag and walked to the front door, my steps steady, my posture straight. As I reached for the handle, I paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. This was not an escape. I was not leaving something behind in fear or uncertainty. I was stepping forward with intention, with clarity, with a decision that had been waiting to be made for far too long. Outside, the air was cool, the early morning light casting a soft glow across the street. I walked to my car, unlocked the door, and sat down behind the wheel. For a moment, I did not start the engine. I simply sat there, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my eyes focused on the quiet road ahead. Then, without overthinking, without second-guessing, I turned the key. The engine came to life, smooth and steady, and as I pulled out of the driveway, I did not look back. I drove without turning on the radio, letting the quiet settle around me in a way that felt different from the silence inside the house. This was not the kind of silence that erased you. This one made space for thought. The streets were familiar, the same route I had taken for years, but that morning everything seemed sharper, more defined, as if I were seeing it with a clarity I had not allowed myself before. I passed the grocery store where I used to shop every Sunday, the small park where Daniel had learned to ride his bike, the coffee shop Richard and I used to visit on Saturday mornings. Each place held a memory, but none of them pulled me backward. Instead, they reminded me that my life had always extended beyond the walls of that house. I turned into the parking lot of the bank and sat for a moment before getting out, my hands resting on the steering wheel just long enough to feel the steady rhythm of my own breathing. This was not a dramatic step. There was no urgency, no rush, just a decision being carried out. Inside, the bank looked exactly as it always had. Clean, quiet, efficient. A place where things were handled with structure and clarity, where documents mattered, where names and signatures carried weight. I approached the front desk, offering a polite smile, and asked to speak with someone about my accounts. The young woman behind the counter nodded and directed me to a small office off to the side. I sat down across from a man in a neatly pressed shirt, his manner professional but approachable. He introduced himself, asked how he could assist me, and waited. I placed my handbag on the desk and removed the folder, setting it down carefully between us. I would like to review the ownership and structure of my accounts, I said, my voice calm, steady, without hesitation. He nodded, opening the folder and scanning the documents with practiced efficiency. As he read, I watched his expression shift slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition of the details that mattered. Names, dates, signatures. Everything here appears to be in order, he said after a moment. Is there something specific you would like to change? I did not answer immediately, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the moment to settle, to be clear in its intention. Yes, I said finally. I would like to ensure that all decisions regarding these accounts require my direct authorization. No changes, no transfers, no restructuring without my explicit consent. He looked up at me then, meeting my eyes with a level of attention that had been missing from so many interactions in my life recently. Of course, he said. We can make that adjustment today. There was no resistance, no questioning, just a process being followed, a request being respected. It was a simple thing, really. A matter of paperwork, of signatures, of confirming what had already been true but had been quietly overlooked. And yet, as I signed my name, I felt something shift in a way that was both subtle and profound. Not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden surge of emotion, but a quiet reclaiming of something that had never truly been lost, only set aside. When we finished, he handed the documents back to me, neatly organized, each page aligned with care. If there is anything else you need, he said, please do not hesitate to reach out. I nodded, thanking him, and placed the folder back into my bag. As I stood to leave, I noticed my reflection in the glass panel beside the door. For a moment, I paused, studying it. The same silver hair, the same lined face, the same posture I had carried for years. And yet, there was something different in the way I held myself, something steadier, more certain. I stepped outside into the late morning light, the air warmer now, the day fully awake. The world had not changed. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged, the people moving through their routines without interruption. But I had, not in a way that would draw attention, not in a way that needed to be explained, but in a way that would quietly alter everything that came next. I walked back to my car, unlocked the door, and sat down, placing my handbag carefully on the passenger seat. For a moment, I allowed myself to sit there, not thinking ahead, not planning the next step, just acknowledging what had already been done. Then I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with a calm sense of direction. Because for the first time in a long time, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was deciding what would happen next. When I returned home, the house looked exactly the same as it always had, quiet, orderly, unchanged on the surface, but I no longer stepped into it the same way. I closed the front door behind me gently, setting my keys down in their usual place, moving through the familiar space with a calm that felt earned rather than habitual. Rachel was in the kitchen, standing by the counter with her laptop open, her attention fixed on something on the screen. She glanced up briefly when she heard me enter, her expression neutral, almost routine. You were out longer than usual, she said, not as a question, but as an observation. I removed my coat slowly, hanging it neatly by the door. I had a few things to take care of. I replied, my voice even, giving her nothing more than what was necessary. She nodded once, already returning her focus to the screen. All right. There was no curiosity in her tone, no interest in the details, and for the first time, I recognized that as an advantage rather than an oversight. Daniel came home shortly after, his arrival marked by the sound of the garage door and the quick, familiar rhythm of his footsteps in the hallway. Hey, he called out, his voice carrying into the kitchen. Hi. I answered, stepping into the room just as he entered. He paused when he saw me, offering a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Everything okay? He asked. It was the kind of question people ask out of habit, not out of intention. Everything is fine, I said, and for the first time in a long while, it was not an attempt to reassure him. It was simply true. He nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further, and moved past me toward Rachel, their conversation picking up almost immediately, their attention shifting back into a space that no longer included me. I watched them for a moment, not with resentment, not with longing, but with a clarity that made everything feel more distant, more defined. That evening, I prepared dinner as I always did, moving through the motions with quiet precision. The sound of the knife against the cutting board, the steady simmer of the pot on the stove, the familiar rhythm of a routine I had followed for years. But something about it felt different. Not forced, not diminished, but intentional. I was no longer cooking to maintain a sense of togetherness that no longer existed. I was cooking because I chose to, because it was something I still knew how to do, something that still belonged to me. When we sat down to eat, the conversation was brief, practical, the same as it had been for months. Rachel mentioned a meeting she had scheduled for later in the week. Daniel talked about a project at work, his tone distracted, his attention divided. I listened, nodding when appropriate, offering small responses when needed, but I did not try to fill the spaces between their words. I let the silence exist without rushing to soften it. At one point, Rachel looked at me, her expression thoughtful in a way that felt different from before. "We should talk sometime this week," she said. "About a few things." I met her gaze calmly. "Of course," I replied. There was no tension in my voice, no hesitation. Just agreement, given on my terms, not as a response to pressure, but as part of a conversation I was now prepared to have. She seemed to register something in that moment, a subtle shift she could not quite place. Her eyes lingered for a second longer than usual before she looked away, returning her attention to her plate. After dinner, I cleared the table as I always did, rinsing the dishes, placing them neatly in the dishwasher, wiping down the counter until it was clean and orderly. The routine remained unchanged, but the meaning behind it had shifted. I was no longer maintaining a role that had been quietly redefined without my consent. I was simply completing a task, one that I could choose to continue or to stop at any time. Later that night, as I sat in my room, the folder resting on the desk beside me, I allowed myself a moment of stillness. Not the kind that comes from waiting, but the kind that follows action. The kind that signals something has already begun. I looked around the room, at the smaller space, the single window, the carefully contained version of my life that had been constructed over time, and I realized that it no longer felt limiting in the same way. Not because it had changed, but because I had. The boundaries that once felt imposed now felt temporary, adjustable, no longer fixed. I picked up the folder and opened it again, reviewing the documents not out of necessity, but out of intention, reinforcing what had already been set in motion. This was no longer about reacting to what Rachel and Daniel might decide. It was about ensuring that whatever happened next would include my voice, my decisions, my control. I closed the folder and placed it back on the desk, my movement steady, deliberate. In the quiet of that room, with the house settled around me, I understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. They were preparing for a conversation they believed they would lead. But when that moment came, they would not be speaking to the same version of me they had grown accustomed to, and they would not be the ones deciding how it ended. The conversation happened 2 days later, exactly as Rachel had planned it, but not in the way she expected it to unfold. It was early evening, the light outside beginning to soften as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the living room floor. I was already seated when they came in, not waiting, not preparing, simply present. Rachel took her usual place on the couch, her posture composed, her hands resting neatly in her lap. Daniel sat beside her, slightly forward, as if bracing himself for something he could not quite define. "We wanted to talk with you," Rachel began, her voice calm, measured, carrying that familiar tone of controlled concern. I nodded once, giving her space to continue, my expression neutral, my attention steady. "We have been thinking about what might be best for everyone moving forward," she said. "And we believe it could be beneficial for you to consider a different living arrangement, somewhere more suitable, with more support." The words were almost identical to what I had heard before, carefully chosen, structured to sound reasonable, even kind. Daniel shifted slightly beside her, his gaze flickering toward me and then away again. "It is just an idea," he added quickly. "We want to make sure you are comfortable." Comfortable. The word lingered for a moment, not because of what it meant, but because of how easily it had been used to justify something that had already been decided. I let the silence settle after they finished speaking, not rushing to respond, not filling the space they had created. It was the same silence I had learned to sit with over the past weeks, The same quiet that had once felt empty, but now felt intentional. Rachel watched me closely, her eyes searching for a reaction she could anticipate, something she could manage. Daniel waited, his posture tense, as if expecting resistance, perhaps even hoping for it, because it would have been easier than what came next. I understand, I said finally, my voice calm, steady, without strain. Rachel blinked once, her expression shifting slightly, not in confusion, but in recalculation. You do? She asked. Yes, I replied. I understand exactly what you were suggesting. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, as if the conversation had moved in a direction neither of them had prepared for. Rachel straightened slightly. Then perhaps we can start looking at some options, she said. There are several places nearby that will not be necessary, I said, not interrupting, but not allowing the sentence to continue. My tone did not change. It remained even, controlled, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Daniel looked at me then, really looked, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if seeing something unfamiliar. What do you mean? He asked. I folded my hands in my lap, my posture relaxed but deliberate. I mean that I have already reviewed my situation, I said. My accounts, the house, all relevant arrangements. And I have made it clear that no decisions regarding those matters will be made without my direct authorization. Rachel's expression stilled, the calm certainty she had carried into the room beginning to shift into something more uncertain. I am not sure I understand, she said carefully. You mentioned wanting what is best for everyone. I continued, meeting her gaze without hesitation. I agree with that. But what is best for me is not something that can be decided without me. And it is not something I am willing to hand over. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly, his expression no longer guarded, but unsettled. Mom, we were just trying to help, he said. I know. I replied, my voice softening just enough to acknowledge the intent without conceding the point. But help does not replace consent. And concern does not give you control. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence was different. It was no longer something I was absorbing. It was something they had to sit with. Rachel's composure remained, but there was a tension beneath it now, a recognition that the conversation was no longer following the path she had outlined. So what are you saying? She asked. I held her gaze, steady, unwavering. I am saying that I am not going anywhere unless I decide to, I said. And if I do, it will be on my terms, not as the result of a discussion I was not included in. Daniel looked down for a moment, his hands clasped together, his thoughts moving in a direction I could not fully see but could clearly feel. Rachel said nothing, her silence more telling than any response she could have given. I stood up then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same calm intention that had guided me through everything that led to this moment. We can continue this conversation another time, I said, when it is truly a conversation. I turned and walked out of the room, not waiting for a reply, not needing one. As I moved down the hallway toward my room, I felt no rush of emotion, no sense of victory or relief. Just a quiet certainty, steady and unshakable. They had believed time was something that worked against me, something that would eventually leave me with no choice. But as I closed the door behind me, I understood something they had not yet realized. Time had not been taking anything away from me. It had been giving me the clarity I needed to take everything back.